But we have seen some significant dryness here in the Matagorda Bay area and then down to the coastal bend and deep South Texas. And so, of course, February, March tend to be our drier months anyways out of the year. So in a lot of cases, this resulted in very little rainfall. And if I expanded this out, it's been a really dry spring so far, late spring and early summer for most of the nation. It's been pretty. We've seen drought development in the Central Plains and also into the southeast United States, and I'll show you that in a minute. So I did want to take you back to kind of how we've gotten to this and where we're probably going to go from this. So this was August of last year, coming off of very similar 2025 to what it is in 2026. We had a very dry spring of 2025, and then we started to get rain in May and June of 25. And so going into one of our hottest and driest times of the year, August and September, we actually were doing really well on the drought situation, minus this area here around San Antonio, which has been in long-term drought now for multiple years. And that is finally resulting in the water situations we have around the Corpus Christi area on the Nueces River down there. And you can see it's this long-term drought that eventually impacts the water supplies. And then as we move forward, into January, you can see this is tends to be our wetter time of year, but we started to get dry again around Labor Day, and drought expanded quickly, especially down here in South Texas with the heat. Remember last year, it was very warm very late into the year. And so by January this year, we started to see severe drought for most areas and extreme drought kind of creeping in. And that has continued to degrade. And so this is last week on March 17th, and you can see severe drought everywhere, extreme drought now in most places, and we've even moved into that exceptional D4 level, which equates to about a 1 in 50 year type of event down in deep South Texas and back along the Rio Grande Plains. Interestingly enough, we've had a little bit of moisture here, kind of in the heart of the hill country up into northwest Texas. But generally speaking, most of the state is in drought. And if you look at just the categories from D0 abnormally dry all the way to D4, we're talking 98, 99% of the state is in some sort of drought, and that's up from 72% about 3 months ago. And so the dryness has really set in here over the winter months. You don't notice it sometimes as much in the winter months because we have some of that coolness, but you certainly notice it as we start to warm up. The other way to kind of look at this is with this product. So this is what we call the KBDI, and this is what this is kind of a fire weather product, but we use it a lot for drought intensity. And generally speaking, these values over here from 0 to 800 equate to inches below the ground. And so 200 is about 2 inches below the ground. 600 would be about 6 inches below the ground. And what this is showing is complete void of moisture in that level. So if you have a value of 3 to 400, there's no moisture from the surface down to about 3 to 4 inches deep. And so when you start getting into these higher end values here between 5 and 700, that's where you start to have a lot of drought stress through a deep layer of the soil. So not only is it your fine grasses, which are starting to green up now in some areas, but this is getting into your bigger shrubs and your mesquites and even some of your larger trees that are struggling. And so that's why we kind of look at this as a fire weather index because the higher the numbers get, the higher the potential for fire, not only grass fire, but also getting into some of the treetops and stuff like that as the larger vegetation dries out. And you can see this is kind of fit the pattern what we've seen over the last few weeks where we've seen fire. Interestingly enough, we actually saw quite a bit of fire here in East Texas in mid-March. A lot of grass fires, not up in the treetops, and then we've seen a lot recently down here, grass fires kind of in the coastal bend, and the green up has just been very slow this year, coming off the winter. Some of that's due to the drought. A lot of that's due to the drought. It's just been a very slow green up. But as we progress deeper into this green up, that should kind of push back a little bit on the fire weather. Although I think this weekend might be one of those weekends we have to watch. We've got a weak front coming down and low humidity. And you can see all the burn bands here, kind of highlighting those areas that we just saw, mainly kind of west of the Brazos River. All right, so this is the other thing I was going to show you. So this is kind of a new index. I haven't had a lot of, time to kind of see how this has worked out, but generally speaking, this is all of the factors that factor into how drought is progressing, and so that incorporates high temperatures, it incorporates humidity, it incorporates wind speed, it incorporates a solar angle, and so that's this product takes all of those factors into consideration and then indicates where you're seeing the most evaporation and the quickest drought development or continuation of drought. And you can see that's kind of what I mentioned earlier. If you look at the nation as a whole, we've seen some really strong responses, and this goes back the last 6 months to very strong either temperature or evaporation trends or wind trends here. And so you can see extensive here in the upper high plains, the western high plains, and the foothills of the Rockies, across the Midwest, and even up into Canada, the Southeast, and Florida, and then down here into Texas. And so this is really leading to a lot of drought development. A lot of this is kind of rapid onset drought development in the last 6 months or so. But you can see these responses down here along the Rio Grande Plains, kind of getting into where we had that D4 category earlier, of really strong. And a lot of this has been driven by the temperatures. And so we've seen some pretty high evaporation rates, and it's mostly the very warm temperatures. So we had a very warm fall. We had a week or two of winter, and then we've been back to very warm conditions, really since mid-late January. And so that's really those warm temperatures are helping pull that moisture from the soil. Interestingly enough, for us down here, typically when we get in this type of pattern, we have a lot of wind, and we haven't had a lot of wind. We've had some gusty days out of the north behind some of these fronts. We've had a little bit of gusty from the south, but it's not day after day after day. And so that's helping a little bit with the evaporation rates. We've also seen some fairly dry air recently, even with the southerly winds. I mean, we've had south winds now for a couple of days, and even the dew points are still like in the low 60s or so, which is pretty rare for us. And so the air mass, even out over the Gulf of Mexico, is relatively dry, and so that's coming in, and it's not producing a lot of humidity. And so we continue to pull that moisture from the soil and the vegetation. And we'll see how that goes as we go forward. I have some hopefully better news as we move forward. But I did want to talk about the what's going on in the Pacific, because this is really going to drive a lot of our weather as we get into late spring, not so much over the summer, but then really into next fall and winter. I think we're going to really transition to a much wetter pattern. So this is October of last year, and you can see all this blue here. This is below normal water temperatures in the central eastern Pacific. So this is a La Nina condition. La Nina is just below normal water temperatures out here, a half a degree Celsius or lower. And we were in a La Nina condition. You see all the warm water over here in the western Pacific. That's really important, to what I'm going to kind of talk about here. And so I'm going to step forward to January of this year. And this is when La Nina kind of reached its peak. You can see the deeper blues here from South America out to south of Hawaii. So this is right in that heart of our kind of dryness here. Again, La Nina tends to be dry and warm for Texas and the Southern Plains, and that's exactly what we've had. And we've really had kind of multiple years now of La Nina. So we've kind of had this back to back to back. And occasionally we'll get a month or two in there where we get a lot of rain, like we did last summer, May and June, which really saved a lot of us from being in worse situations than we are now. And then I'm going to step forward because this has been a fairly big change from January. We've seen a significant amount of warming in the last 2 months. I mean, if you just think about how much it takes to warm this much water, we've gone from below normal water temperatures now to above normal, and this is significantly above normal here off the coast of South America. And so this is just the beginnings of transitioning out of that La Nina state into what we call a neutral state. So we're going into kind of neutral right now and likely heading towards an El Nino. And the big question is how quickly does this continue to transition? So far in the last 2 months, we've seen a very quick transition of the sea state here. This warm water here off the coast of South America is going to spread to the west as the trade winds weaken. So El Nino conditions tend to weaken the trade winds between South America and Australia. And as that happens, we don't get that pulling up or the upwelling of the cold water here off South America. So this warm water here is then pushed westward, and you're going to see eventually this kind of warming tongue develop here along the equator. And the question now is, how strong is this going to get? We're pretty confident we're going towards El Nino. How strong is it going to get, and how quickly are we going to get to that El Nino? Some of the models are showing us into an El Nino condition by May. That would be really, really fast. I think that's probably a little bit on the fast side. And then there's also other models that I'll show you that are moving us to El Nino more towards the late summer, which is probably a more realistic look at this. And so I did want to show the water temperatures here. It's kind of showing this in a graph. And these are the regions. So we have Nino 1 and 2 here off the coast of South America. We kind of pay attention here to this Nino 3.4. This is really what kind of controls a lot of the changes when the water's warm or cool in that portion of the Pacific. That's when you start to get the atmospheric responses across the globe, and you get these different patterns setting up. But you can see here Nino 1 and 2, significant warming to well above normal off the coast of South America. So this is really impressive here as those trade winds have really weakened. But the trend here since January for all of these regions has generally been a warming trend. 3.1 is here a little bit lagging, but there's a lot of very warm water just below the surface. So we're talking 300 feet below the surface, where we still have a little bit of this cool water. Below that surface, there's a lot of warm water kind of sloshing back from the Western Pacific. And so I think that's really kind of helping push some of these really fast anomalies. So here we are coming into March, really right at the edge now of La Nina, kind of creeping over that into what we call neutral. So neutral is between a half a degree negative and a half a degree positive. So anything with water temperatures in that range is kind of a neutral or normal condition. El Nino would be zero point 0.5 above, and La Nina is zero point 0.5 below Celsius. And so you can see pretty much good agreement here that we're going to creep up in the direction of an El Nino. And again, the consensus here, or the mean, this kind of black line, black dash line out in time here, is suggesting this by early to midsummer, so May, June, July, that we start to approach an El Nino threshold, and then we just keep going into next fall. And you can see some of these members getting really crazy up here, 1.5, 2, even higher than that. And what's interesting is the European model is actually forecasting to go well above 2 as we get into the late fall or I'm sorry, the late summer and early fall of this year. And so I think it's probably an outlier right now. We'll see. So 2 degrees above normal is what we call a super El Nino. Those are relatively rare. They don't happen very often. And so, to forecast something like that this time of year, with this type of sea surface pattern would be a little bit out there. But even so, we do think that the El Nino is coming potentially as early as late spring, early summer. The question is, how quickly does the atmosphere kind of couple with this? And it usually is a lag time between when we move from an El Nino and when the atmosphere kind of responds to it. And the other thing is during the summer months, so we're talking June, July, August, September, El Ninos and La Ninas don't tend to affect our weather here as much in the state of Texas. So we have a kind of a bigger effect in our cool season months, so our Octobers through say April-ish and May. And the reason we don't have as big of an impact in the summer months is because we typically don't have westerlies coming in. So we don't have a subtropical jet stream. We don't have westerly winds aloft. We actually reverse our wind direction in the summer and come more from the easterlies, the tropical easterlies. And so that tends to not be affected as much by El Nino. So I'm going to step through the precipitation maps here going forward. So this is for the 3 month period for April through May through June. And for those that kind of saw the presentation back in January, so we looked at January, March, and January, February, March, and we definitely saw a below normal rainfall signal in the southern plains of the state of Texas. And I'm going to step through this, and you're going to see at least in a normal signal, if not slightly above. And so this is some really decent news. The question is this going to start in April, or does this linger a little bit longer and wait until May and June before we start getting more normal type rainfall. And my looking at this since January, I've always kind of thought April was going to be that transition month where we started to get more rainfall in the southern plains of Texas. And I'm still kind of thinking that, but it may be a little bit later into the month. I know next week is starting kind of a pattern change, maybe starting to get some rain. But we've seen this before in these long range kind of outlooks, the 10 to 14 day outlook, where we see these storm systems, they look really good. And by the time they get into the shorter range, they go too far to the north. And there's two things happening. One is the jet stream is just a little bit further to the north this year, and so these storms are coming into the southwest and then ejecting kind of northeast across the central northern plains. The second, we have this big subtropical high that's been sitting down here around Florida back into the Western Gulf, and that's kind of deflecting the storm systems off in that northeast direction. So instead of coming eastward across Texas, dragging fronts and precipitation, they're being deflected off to the north and east. And so we kind of need two things to happen. We need the storm track to shift a little bit south, and we need this ridge of high pressure out here in the Gulf and the southeast United States to kind of shift a little bit to the south and the east, and that would put us in a more favorable line for precipitation. So this is an American model, so it does show a near normal, maybe a slightly above normal anomaly here. I will say this model's been bouncing around a lot. So if you look at it, you'll it runs, and then one run will show this, the next run will show more drier conditions. So I don't have a lot of faith in this because it bounces around so much. The European is surprisingly wet. This does hold some strengths with me when you start to see this type of pattern here in the southern plains. So this is kind of an above normal precipitation pattern. The question is it again focused a little bit more off to the north in Oklahoma, North Texas, Northeast Texas, or do we finally get some of this a little bit further south here down the coastal bend in South Texas? But the good news is you're starting to see that signal there of near normal or above normal. The good news is we're not seeing below normal forecasted rainfall from this. Also notice all of this wetness here that develops probably toward the summer south of Hawaii. So that's a strong signal here that El Nino is coming into play, and we're seeing a lot of tropical convection down here along the equator. And notice here also the equal response to that is a very, very dry Caribbean and Atlantic. And so this is probably going to have some pretty big implications for our hurricane season. And I'll talk about a little bit that toward the end. The Canadian model also kind of similar, kind of just keeps us with near normal precipitation. Again, this is a positive trend because we've been below normal. So if we can just get near normal precipitation, that's going to move us in the right direction. It's not going to get rid of the drought. It's not going to eliminate our water problems, but it's moving us in the right direction. Maybe even some above normal anomalies across parts of the state. So again, I think the precipitation is kind of moving us in the right direction. And if you take the mean of all this or the average of all these models, and this is valid through June, you can kind of see just near normal type precipitation here across the state of Texas. So again, coming out of below normal, moving towards near normal. And I wouldn't be completely surprised if we saw some above normal precipitation at somewhere in the southern plains in Texas as we get into uh, late April, May, maybe even in early June. It could continue to be wet a little bit later this year. And that's really what we'd like to see. And so, looking from the Climate Prediction Center here, they're not really going either way with it. They're kind of hedging their bets here and just keeping kind of near normal conditions. Interestingly, they have this above stuff here over Florida and the southeast United States. And this is, in La Nina years, this tends to be very dry here. And so I think we're starting to see that kind of transition out of that. Notice the dryness here creeping out. You have rapid onset drought here into the plains. This could be a big problem this summer going into the plains. This dry signal is really showing up. So while we may do a little bit better down in here, the central plains and maybe even creeping over to the Midwest could be in for some rough dryness this summer and drought. As far as temperatures go, no big surprises with the temperatures above normal, generally speaking. You can kind of see the higher signal here in the western plains up into the central plains and then in the southwest United States. This would tend to indicate early summer high pressure kind of developing here in this area. and that's not over Texas. So you don't see the big heat anomaly here focused over Texas or northern Mexico. And if we did have high pressure sit up kind of in this region, New Mexico, North Texas, Colorado, this area, we'd be on the southern edge of that down here. And so if you think of how high pressures work, they rotate clockwise. That would produce an easterly flow here into Texas, which is a moisture flow off the Gulf. And so this would really benefit us with our sea breeze thunderstorms, the stuff moving in off the Gulf every afternoon. If in fact this kind of what happened. So there's some positive here, and we're not super hot. Also down here in South Texas in the coastal bend. At least that's on the American model. Interestingly enough, the European, and I dove into this a little bit because it had a little bit of a cool anomaly here in the high plains and portions of northwest and west Texas. And if this is focused more in May, which it is, this would indicate some sort of trough here setting up on the eastern edge of the southwest United States and into western Texas. And would be a very, very favorable and a very active storm pattern here for the southern plains and Texas. And so we'll see. This is not really showing up in some of the other models. But you can see a big, big high, big ridge here in the southwest, and then this kind of downstream trough here, maybe in the southern plains. This would be a very stormy pattern for the southern plains, and this is probably why the European was showing that above normal precipitation in this same area. So again, we're seeing the kind of hints here of favorable things, but the question is when exactly does it happen? And how much precipitation are we really going to get? Is it one of these systems that comes in, it hangs around for 2 or 3 days, we get some rainfall and it moves on, and we kind of go back to dryness, or are we potentially going to transition into a pattern where we get storm system after storm system after storm system? We've kind of seen that in some of these years in the past. We saw that last year where we transitioned in May. They got very wet, and it continued to be very wet for about a 6 to 8 week period. And then this is the multi-model kind of temperature mean here from April through June. So nothing really standing out big time on the temperatures. Obviously, we're going to be a little bit above average. And you can see the CPC here with the kind of the high to the west. So what are we kind of looking at? We have drought in place. I think, like I mentioned, we're going to see some drought development in areas of the central plains here. I think this dryness is going to intensify. We don't have, at the moment, we don't have any signs of kind of improvement or removal here, but I think just looking at what we kind of looked at, I think we're going to start to see some better conditions with the drought. The question is just how much, is it if we get to normal rainfall, I think that helps a lot of y'all out with getting crops up and getting enough water. If you get a couple inches here and there, it definitely doesn't help with as much with our water supply issues, and we're getting into some really, and I'm going to show that here in a second, some really concerning trends with our water supply issues. So generally speaking, nearing neutral INSO conditions. Again, will we transition El Nino late spring, or will it be more towards the late summer? If the warming continues at the rate we're going right now, it would be more towards May, June. We'll see. I think that's a little fast. Rainfall generally, I have below normal here, but I think it's going to be more near normal, maybe even above normal as we get more towards the later parts of the spring, so towards the May period. And fingers crossed, April right now, if you kind of look at some of the weather over the next 2 weeks or so, it does get stormy in Texas. But again, I'm a little concerned that it stays more to the north, and we just can't beat that ridge down the Gulf down enough. And so that's kind of the outlook. I think we're going to get more normal precipitation. The question again, and right now it's such a critical question of is that later or is that sooner? And we're just going to have to see. All right, I didn't want to go through the water supply because we have seen some fairly significant decreases in storage capacity, especially at Texana. So this is Texana, and for March 19th, it's down about 8 feet. It's down 53% full of conservation pool. But the astounding number, that's down 13% in the last 3 months. And there's been a lot of drawdown on the lake. with respect to water request and water draw. And so, right now, if you kind of look at the graph since 2000, this would be the second lowest it's been, minus, of course, the horrible drought back in 2011. And so we're heading in a nasty direction here for Texana if we don't start getting some moisture and some rain and some inflows into the lake. We've really not had a lot of inflow into the lake this winter and spring. Of course, most of us know about the water situation in Corpus Christi. It's reaching the point where it's getting particularly dire down there, and there's a lot of different messages coming out of, are they going to reach water emergencies in the late spring, or is it going to be more toward the fall? Um, and you can see here at Choke Canyon. So these are the Choke Canyon and also Lake Corpus Christi are the two water supply reservoirs that feed Corpus Christi. And so you can see they're on the Nueces River. And you can see the drawdown here is continuing just unabated on Choke Canyon. And so we're down to only 8% full. We're down 41 feet. And there's just virtually no inflow at all into this lake from the Nueces River. And there hasn't been since probably July-ish of 2020 of last year, 2025. And then when you look over at Lake Corpus Christi, again, just a very dire situation since impoundment of this lake back in the 50s. So, interestingly enough, here's the big drought of the 50s, and we are at or below some of those early impoundment levels of the 50s. And so, again, this is really serious down here. We really need moisture. There's a lot of things going on to try to get water to Corpus Christi to avoid the water emergency down there. And here's Falcon on the Rio Grande. Interestingly, Falcon did have a bump here, so they actually hit their lowest peak back in I think February, and they did have a little moisture that's come up, and so the Falcons actually come up about 2 feet, but we're still in pretty bad conditions down here on the Rio Grande also. So those two water supply situations in the Oasis and the Rio Grande continue to be a big problem down here for South Texas. And we're starting to see issues creep up, even up at Texana, where we're just not seeing the inflows. Texana is a very small watershed and pool lake, so it can be very flashy with the Lavaca and Navidad rivers coming in there. So if we get moisture on those rivers, that lake can respond very quickly. But we don't tend to see the responses down here. These are much bigger systems that we're dealing with down here on the Rio Grande, and to some degree on the Nueces. And the Nueces is going to take a lot of water just to get the river to run. It's just so dry for so long, and it's really, really difficult. And that's why I kind of showed that hydrologic drought map at the early part. It's really hard to pull yourself out of these hydrologic droughts once you get into them. And so yeah, you can get some rainfall, you can get bumps in the lake, but to really get sustained water runoff, you have to have storm system after storm system after storm system. Or you can have a big rainfall event like a tropical system that creeps in. And that leads me into the last thing I did want to talk about is the hurricane season. So we are going to be moving into that. It's late March. Predictability this time of year is a little bit low, especially with so much being guided by what's happening in the Pacific with that El Nino and La Nina. And so if we do transition earlier in the season, so say May and June towards El Nino, I think that's really going to cap the Atlantic hurricane season. So for the first time in a long while, we could be looking at kind of what we call a below average season. So an average season would be 14 named storms. So we'd be looking something below that. It tends to favor development close in these types of years and in El Nino years. And the Gulf of Mexico, generally speaking, is not as influenced by the El Nino La Nina as the rest of the basin. So the Caribbean and the Atlantic are really heavily influenced by what's going on in the Pacific, and it produces El Ninos produce a lot of wind shear in the Caribbean. They produce that kind of dry sinking air, which we kind of saw in the European model there. And so it just creates really unfavorable conditions in the Caribbean and the Atlantic for tropical systems. The Gulf kind of doesn't really respond that way. The biggest response we tend to see in the Gulf of Mexico is if we get a lot of hurricanes off the west coast of Mexico, which we can get in El Nino years because you have warmer water. That upper level outflow coming off of those hurricanes tends to produce some shear across the Gulf of Mexico. But that tends to be later in the year in the season, so your August September timeframe. So I'm a little nervous going into the season with June and July. I do think the Gulf does have an opportunity there to produce some kind of homegrown tropical storms, maybe as we get into June and July, also up toward the Bahamas. And then the other thing we kind of have to watch for as we get into August and September, with the Atlantic being so unfavorable, likely, and the Caribbean being unfavorable, do these tropical waves move all the way across and then find a little bit more favorable condition in the Gulf of Mexico? And so they try to develop in the Gulf of Mexico. That is a potential that we have this year. So it's kind of a double-edged sword for us here in Texas with respect to El Nino. We need the rainfall. We want the rainfall. It beats back a little bit on our hurricane season, but it kind of makes the Gulf more of a question mark as we get into this season. And we'll start to have some of the seasonal outlooks come out in the next couple of weeks or so. But I think the numbers themselves are going to be lower. But what does that do for like impacts on the Gulf Coast and stuff like that? We'll just have to see. So with that, I'll take any questions that anybody has about anything we chatted about.
So, Jeff, I'm going to stop the recording. I actually pushed the button a little late, so people are going to miss their first slide in the introduction. But I'm going to stop the recording and then we'll open it for questions.